Chapter 13, Negotiating Buyer Concerns. This chapter focuses on the fourth step, negotiation, in the 6 steps of the presentation plan. The first objective of this chapter is to describe the principles of formal negotiations as part of a win-win strategy. So what is negotiation? One definition is working to reach an agreement that's mutually satisfactory to both the buyer and the seller. Negotiation involves resolving the problems or concerns that prevent people from buying. And as we noted in Chapter 1, the salesperson increasingly serves as a consultant or a resource and provides solutions to the buyer's problems. The consultant seeks to establish and maintain long-term relationships with customers. And the ability to negotiate problems or objections is one of the most effective ways to create value for the customer. Today, salespeople must be prepared to anticipate and negotiate buyer concerns and problems. To negotiate with them effectively, salespeople first need to engage in detailed planning. Ironically, one of the most common mistakes that negotiators commit is not doing their homework, such as gathering information prior to the negotiation. And so here, this slide outlines the steps that a salesperson can take to anticipate and negotiate problems. First, think strategically and plan for the negotiation of buyer concerns. You can review common types of resistance, review the methods of negotiating buyer resistance, and prepare a negotiations worksheet. And then also think about activities during negotiations. So recognize and understand verbal and nonverbal cues. Validate the problem for the customer. Find some point of agreement, and don't allow your anger or irritation to surface. Answer all of the customer's concerns and be alert for those closing cues. This slide notes several steps that a salesperson can take to prepare for formal negotiations. A key point is that exhaustive preparation is more important than aggressive arguments. The salesperson must decide who will be in the negotiations. It may be a team negotiation, or it may be an individual. Value should not only be thought of in terms of purchase price, since there are many aspects to dealing beyond a price. And in setting goals, the concept of BATNA, or best alternative to negotiated agreement, is important. And we'll talk more about that in just a moment. The salesperson should have a clear agenda and be prepared to adapt just as he or she would in other aspects of the sales process. A negotiations worksheet will help the salesperson to be systematically organized, which we'll also discuss later on how to do that. The best alternative to a negotiated agreement, or a BATNA, is defined as what alternatives will be acceptable to you if your negotiation doesn't succeed. You'll likely have to make concessions in formal negotiations. Therefore, you need to think about and assess both your and the customer's BATNA, basically the bottom line, right? And then also think about the zone of possible agreement, or the ZOPA. It's another important planning tool and defined as the space between the seller's walk-away point and the buyer's highest willingness to pay. So the walk-away point represents the lowest offer that you would be willing to accept, and it's also called the reservation value. For example, if your walk-away point is $42.65 million and the highest price that the buyer is willing to pay is $48 million, then your ZOPA is any offer that falls within that range, or a zone of 5.35 million, which is the difference between 48 million and 42.65. So this table highlights a range of objections, sources of hesitation, and associated requests. So for example, often you'll get the resistance of the price is too high. And really this is a difference of perceived cost versus benefit. This is where you need to articulate the value of your product or services. Another objection very often is to think about it. This is where someone's afraid to make a bad decision. So your response to that needs to be to create comfort and provide proof that it's the right decision. Sometimes people will pass the buck to someone else and say, I really need to talk to my boss. What they're really saying is, I'm not sure that I can justify my decision. This is where you need to step in and help to reduce risks, show the benefits, go over everything that's of value to the customer. Sometimes they'll say, I need more quotes. This is really them saying that I'm unsure that you're my best option. So here we provide targeted solutions and specific points of value. Ask them what they're going to get quoted at other places and see if you can, again, target your response to those specific areas of interest. Another objection might be, I'm really happy with my current provider. I'm loyal to them. They really don't see the benefit of a change here. This is where you have to differentiate yourself from the competitor that they're already comfortable with. What makes you different? What can you do better than your competitor? Or perhaps you have a bad history. Maybe this buyer had a past experience with the previous salesperson or your company, and it's affecting their current view. This is where you must offer proof of change or proof of your own personal performance in helping them to solve their problem. During the formal negotiation session, it's beneficial to master the skills presented throughout the book and establish a good social contact, ask good questions, listen actively, use proof devices when appropriate, and apply the methods of negotiating objections. So some golden rules for success include, number one, understand the problem from your customer's perspective. What is their pain point? Create alternative solutions that can add value for them based on those specific pain points. Periodically review acknowledged points of agreement, the things that you agree on and that they can say yes to. Do not make concessions too quickly, especially on price. Remember that most negotiations will conclude in the final 20% of the time allowed, so you have to allow yourself time to get there. And then finally, always know when to walk away and have that point in mind before you enter into the negotiation. Before the presentation, it's important to prepare a negotiations worksheet similar to the one in your book and shown here. This shows you how to combine methods that are frequently used to effectively respond to customer concerns. So, for example, here you see that 15 cases of olives will take up valuable space in my receiving room. It's already crowded. That's a need. They need more space. So a possible response might be a combination of direct denial and maybe a superior benefit. So we could say, you won't have to face that problem. With the aid of our merchandising plan, you can display 10 cases immediately on the floor, and only 5 cases will have to come from the reserve stock. You should be able to move all 15 cases in about 2 weeks. Or perhaps they say, this is a poor time of the year to buy a large order of olives. People aren't buying olives right now. That's a timing issue. So here we could perhaps do an indirect denial and maybe a third-party testimony. Well, I agree that it's been a problem in the past, but consumer attitudes seem to be changing. We found that olives sell well all year long if they're displayed properly. Most people are using olives in the preparation of omelets, pizza, and other dishes. Well, of course, most relish trays, they also feature olives. We'll supply you with a point of purchase material that provides the kitchen-tested ways to use this item. We'll make it as easy as we can. Another objection might be, I have to stay within my budget. Of course, the price objection. Focus on the benefits here. As you know, olives represent a high profit item. The average margin is 26%, and with the addition of our $1 per case allowance, the margin will rise to about 30%. This order will give you a good return on your investment. Finally, I'm already satisfied with my current supplier. That's a source issue. This is where we ask questions and maybe do a trial order. What can I do to get you to just take a trial order. Very simple ways to respond to specific concerns, but you have to think carefully about what kind of concern it is. Keep in mind that the customer's culture, it's important to understand and accommodate when you're negotiating in the international area. And of course, in the global economy, international sales is much more common than it was even just a decade or two ago. So across cultures, it's important to remember that you need to understand and accommodate their culture when you're negotiating. Selling in certain cultures often requires more time in bonding and building rapport. And finally, several meetings may be needed to lay the groundwork for an actual sale in the international arena. The second learning objective from this chapter is to describe common types of buyer concerns. Salespeople learn that patterns of buyer resistance exist, and therefore they can anticipate that certain concerns may arise during the sales call. With this information, it's possible to be better prepared for each customer meeting. The great majority of buyer concern falls into 5 categories that include need, product, source, time, and price. The third learning objective is to discuss specific methods of negotiating buyer concerns. And there are 8 specific methods of negotiating buyer concerns. In analyzing each buyer concern, we should try to determine which method could be most effective. And in most cases, we can use a combination of the following methods to negotiate those concerns. So the direct denial involves refuting the opinion or the belief of the prospect. Indirect denial means to bend a little and acknowledge that the prospect is partially correct. Of course, when denying in any manner, it's important to help the customer feel important and valued, and not simply to say, "You're wrong." Some additional methods of negotiating buyer concerns include asking questions, voicing the superior benefits of your product, creating a demonstration to show the product or service in action, making a trial offer, giving a third-party testimony, or perhaps postponing and getting more information. Successful salespeople are sensitive to clues that indicate the client feels that something's wrong. And one way to empathize with the client's concerns is to use the feel, felt, found strategy. And here's how it works. Assume that the customer is concerned about the complexity of the new computer software and says to you, "I don't think that I'll ever understand the process." Your response might be, "I understand how you feel, Mr. Pearson. Many of my customers felt the same way until they started using the software, and they found it quite easy to master." So you feel, you empathize with their concern. You give them an example, right? They felt the same way, and then they found something that overcomes their fears. Again, a very simple method to use and very effective when addressing a client's concerns. The fourth learning objective from this chapter is to outline methods for creating value in formal negotiations. The do's and don'ts on this slide show how salespeople can create value during formal negotiations, but without compromising profits. Do clarify price concerns with questions. Do add value with a cluster of satisfactions or things that the customer can say yes to based on what your product does. Don't make price the focal point of the sales presentation. Don't apologize for the price. And do point out the relationship between price and quality, as well as the difference between price and cost, because mathematically, those two things can be very different. The fifth and final learning objective from this chapter is to understand how to work with buyers who are trained in negotiations. Professional buyers often learn to use specific tactics in dealing with salespeople. So it's important to be prepared for their responses and the challenges that they may put forward. For example, in the budget limitation tactic, the buyer might say, we like your proposal, but our budget for the convention is only $8,500. Is the buyer telling the truth, or is the person testing your price? We really don't know. So the best approach in this instance is to take the budget limitations seriously and to use appropriate negotiation strategies. One strategy could be to reduce the price by eliminating some items, sometimes described as unbundling. So for example, well, I understand that your budget limit is $8,500, and I absolutely see where you're coming from on that. So we can certainly accommodate that $8,500. However, that would not include the free shuttle to and from the airport or the extra day at a discounted rate, something along that line. The 5 tactics here represent only a sample of those methods used by buyers. But to prepare for these and other tactics, salespeople need to plan their negotiating strategies in advance and have clear goals. Decide in advance what terms you can and cannot accept, and it's important that you have the authority to set prices. Buyers who want to do business with someone who has decision-making authority. So you need to be prepared for the budget limitation tactic, take it or leave it, let us split the difference tactic, and if-then tactic, and sell low now and make profits later tactic. All of these can be beneficial to be prepared for in making sure that you negotiate appropriately and are able to close the sale.